Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Empowering You. Today's guest is Scott, and he is coming from us from the West Coast. Is that correct? Are you on the West Coast?
Actually, I live in Ann Arbor, Michigan. It's just I work on the West Coast. So
Oh, okay.
people
Uh,
often ask where my home base is. I tell them the TSA agency at the Detroit airport.
mm, that's interesting because I'm also in Michigan, so I didn't even connect that. That's fun. Okay. Yeah, do you want to share with the audience a little bit about who you are and what it is that you do?
Sure. My name is Scott Goldman. I am a clinical and high performance psychologist. I tend to think of mental health and mental wellness and optimal performance as a blend and a blur, as well as creating optimal environments so that people can really get the best out of whatever quest they're on. So, yeah, that would be me in a nutshell.
Yes, I love it. Um, so what is your take on mental health and the thought around that and the stigma around that when it comes to athletes, entertainment, the industry and that aspect with it?
Um, so I think when we talk about mental health and wellness in any kind of special group, I tend to think about like what's the same versus what's different. So there are some aspects of mental health, like suicidal ideation, that I think is fairly universal. However, the factors that could contribute to that suicidal ideation can actually be fairly unique. So I think there are times where patient care is it doesn't really matter what their craft or what their day job is, so to speak. And then there's other times where I think you do have to appreciate the unique aspects. And so that's when you go, okay, what's the same? Suicidal ideation is the same. What's different? The kinds of stressors and repercussions of those kinds of ideations. It can be different for a banker than it is for a student athlete, than a professional athlete, than a coach, than an accountant, than a plumber. So,
Do you do you think that when it comes to mental health, and with the the stigma with it being whether it's athletes, entertainment, like, artist versus a banker, an officer, a student, a mom, a dad, do you think that it's looked at differently?
I think it is looked at differently, and I think it should be looked at differently. So, I'll give you a couple concrete examples where my head goes. I remember I was working once with a 300-pound offensive lineman in a very warm climate university setting. So it was 100 degrees in June. They were doing stadiums, which is, they run up the steps to the top of a stadium, a football stadium. That's a pretty hard task for anyone. Add 300 pounds, it's even harder. He was diagnosed with depression, and the psychiatrist gave him lithium, which, is a fairly common prescription, but it also happens to be a salt. So, if he was working, say, like in a rice field out in the humidity and hot temperatures of Vietnam, that would also be a bad choice to prescribe lithium for. So I guess my point is this is any good psychiatrist or any good psychologist or mental health provider, you got to kind of recognize like, hey, anyone can be diagnosed with depression, and the interventions should be kind of bespoke to the needs and unique demands of that individual's situation, craft, and responsibilities. Because his life was in danger. His life was put in danger by the psychiatrist, just miscalculation. I think the other thing to note is sometimes the demands. I think I came the way I kind of phrase it with team docs and coaches and folks is sub baseline. So for example, let's just take student athletes. I don't know why I've got kind of student athlete on my brain right now, but like with student athletes, they got to juggle a full course load, a full practice schedule, travel, everything else. And and they can't reschedule. Like you can't reschedule a final. Sometimes you can ask a professor and they might give you grace, but sometimes they don't. But you definitely can't reschedule a game. So if you're a volleyball player, for example, and you've got an 8 o'clock game, it's not like you can just go to the referee and say, hey, like I had a flat tire, I'm running a little bit late. Can we start at 8:25? And so I mention that because um, the schedule demand for certain individuals is just so leveraged, right? So it's like, oh, I get up at 6 a.m. and we have workouts, and then I go to class, and then I have practice, and et cetera, and then study hall. And so, 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. is almost like a standard work day. So when someone's feeling depressed, instead of going from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m., maybe they still have the obligation of 6 a.m., but they move a little bit slowly, or they start to wind their day down around 7 p.m. Or they're, the demand and the pressure of it all, instead of, getting the paper done 2 weeks early, they get it done right on time. So to the professor, they just see someone who's well within kind of the normal population of the class. But to that high performer, them turning the paper on time is actually sub baseline of their own level of performance or task demand. So I think sometimes, you look at something like from a diagnostic standpoint, like clinical depression, and you're going, well, they get out of bed every day. So like some of the symptomology that we would associate, they just don't meet the criteria. But when you talk to them and you listen to how they're navigating through their world, you're going, this is not how they carry at their own norm. So that's where I say it's recognizing what's the same and identifying what's different.
Right. And so how do you think with that part, people or, doctors or the community, start to recognize and make a shift there? Like, how do you think there could be like a start to a change?
Yeah, well, I mean, and that was one of the things that I'm really proud and honored to have contributed to when the NCAA wrote their best practices and guidelines. It was all about that kind of conceptualization of like, okay, how do we educate and how do we meet people where their needs are at? And I think um, it's interesting because you're starting to even see some universities that are branching out, not just in the athletic department, putting a counselor involved, but they're putting them in, like, say, the dentist school and the med school and the law school. And so, I think one of the aspects is to study the population and meet the needs of that population, give them the resources so that they can be successful. I also think, though, and thanks for just letting me wax poetic for a second, but when you think about like ADA, the American Disability Act, ADA 504, what ADA 504 states is that we have to make reasonable accommodations. So sometimes I'll use this analogy like with coaches, where you go like, look, if somebody is like, say, wheelchair bound, the university is obligated to make accommodations that would include ramps instead of stairs so that the person who's wheelchair bound can make it to their classroom. But what you don't do is you don't have the entire class reschedule to the person who's wheelchair bound's dorm room kind of thing. So that way, so on a reasonable accommodation for somebody who's suffering with a mental health condition is a coach making an allowance of like certain aspects, like maybe, missing practices. But you might not necessarily make the allowance where it's like they don't have to practice at all and then still expect to get the amount of playing time that they feel like they deserve um, come game day, stuff like that.
Yeah. Um, how do you think a conversation or we'll use the stigma around mental health could maybe take a shift change with the judgment behind it when it comes to athletes, entertainers versus the normal population. And maybe to be a little clear, if you have uh, someone who's elite versus a normal citizen with a mental health, they're not going to get treated the same, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. And I feel like I I kind of take a little bit of a contrarian role here. So what I'm about to say might not be very popular, and forgive me. It's just sort of my experience and my belief. I think sometimes us preaching about eradicating the stigma can further stigmatize the stigma. So I'll give you a concrete example. My first job in this space, in the elite space, was at the University of Arizona's athletic department. And at the time, there was only six embedded providers. There's only, six to maybe a dozen embedded providers. So there just wasn't very many people doing it. So it was like, okay, what's the model? What's best practice? We didn't really know. So our head athletic trainer, Andy Cohen, who I give a ton of credit to, and our team doc, Dr. Porter, like unbelievable teammates and collaborators. Where they're like, where do you want your office set up? And I was like, well, we should have it be like in a private area. And they're like, well, what about like the frequency of the training room? Wouldn't that be good so that it's more? And I'm like, no, 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 we should have it be off in this like private corner of the athletic department so we can respect people's dignity and confidence, yeah, and all this kind of like secrecy. And then they said, okay, let's do this. Let's create two offices, a private space and one right in the athletic training room so everybody can see you. I found 80% of the athletes just went to the place that was more convenient. They didn't want the private space. They wanted the one that was just close. And there was one time when I first started work, they would come knock on my door at the public space one. And I would then kind of say, hey, I'll meet you at the private space one and we can walk separately. And all this kind of things that I did to ensure their dignity, or at least what I thought. And I had this moment where on our women's soccer team, there was two players, teammates that were both seeing me. And so as one was walking to the private office, the other one was getting her ankles taped. And I was like, oh, this is going to be awkward because they're both going to kind of know. And the one that was getting her ankles taped grabbed a Kleenex box and threw it to the player that was on her way to the private office and said, hey, you're going to need these. I used up all the ones in the last session. I used up the box in the last. And so it dawned on me, like a lot of these athletes, male, female, and even non-binary and every, when they're getting like, sometimes they're getting their groins taped, they're just pulling down their pants in the training room. Like it was interesting because they seemed to make it much less of a deal than I was being sensitive to this being a deal.
Yes.
So to your point, and part of what your question, which I think is great, is like, I think when people have a larger audience, when people have more followers and they're like, hey, this is something I do. Like, this is just part of my regimen. I brush my teeth and I do my push-ups and then I, engage in a mindful exercise. Like, I think that's great. I think that kind of normalizes it too. But I also think we as providers should still maintain levels of respect and dignity of the people we are charged with caring for. And part of it should be allowing them to identify what's uncomfortable and not uncomfortable about what they're navigating. Because what I found was people cared a lot less about their own mental health and everything else, and people knowing about their own mental health than I thought they would. And so that was on me. That was my growth curve.
Yeah, and you are absolutely right. I have also learned that through my own personal journey and through, with my own clients, that is, when you think you are protecting them and trying to not, speak and keep their privacy, everybody else already knows and everybody already knows what's happening. And you're just like, oh, yeah, they know what's going on. And they talk, right? Like they all talk, they know what's going on, and you think you're keeping it confidential, but no, really they, you know. they talk in groups. So that is very true to that. Um,
One of the nicest compliments I've ever received, like, like I've been very fortunate and blessed. Like, like even like behind me, I've been given, game balls in the NFL and things like that for contribution. But one of the nicest things that I'll always cherish is I was working for an NFL team and a free agent. He had only been with the team for about a week, knocks on my door, comes in the office and says, "Hey," he goes, "I asked the locker room, and the locker room says you're all right. And that's why I'm here." And I was like, I don't know. It's just it meant a lot to me because the locker room doesn't lie. Like that's a sacred space, and that's where they have real talk and everything else. And so when he was like, "Hey, like you've got the locker room," I was like, "Wow." Like I said, it just meant a lot to me. So I don't know where that thought came from. Just felt like it was worth sharing. I guess, part of it and what stimulates it is like so like my dad is my hero, my mentor, and he was a physician, and one of the things he always taught me was about patient-centered care. And I really value the idea of empowering the individual to be in control of the care that they receive, regardless of whether it's below the neck or above it.
yeah.
Anyways, sorry, you're about to ask a question. I
No,
got all
please.
poetic.
No, please don't apologize. And I really appreciate you sharing that. And that is great that you were able to provide that space and be that person for them. Not a lot of people are able to do that. So that says a lot about you and who you are as a doctor. So
Thanks.
good. Um, so as a conversation for, public wise, like when people hear athletes, artists versus someone, uh, a mom, dad, someone in the military having mental health, I feel like I'm going to say judgment comes across differently. Um, do you do you know how maybe why that is, or what you think could maybe change that a little bit?
I don't know why because I've never studied it. And I do believe in empirically validated best practice. So I always try to temper my statements, especially in a public forum, to things that are more factual and science backed. But if you're asking for sort of like, like if this was like a courtroom and it was like, well, okay, but in your expert opinion, so I can just
Yeah.
say, hey, this is an expert opinion. I can offer an opinion. I think, um, I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? I had,
No, please
I,
don't apologize. No,
yeah,
it's
yeah.
perfectly fine. So I think what it is, and I'm just trying to get more, um, in my opinion, right? Like, so I'm going to go, I'm with you on, in my own opinion, and what I have seen is when, a celebrity of some sort comes out with having something of mental health, it's good for them, right? Like not like, oh, good for them, like, but no one is judging them, right? Like it's okay, right? Like let them get the help they need because they need to get the help, and I'm happy for them, right? Like that's good. I'm glad they're getting the help. However, when someone is in a work field, and they're at their 9 to 5 job doing what they need to do, if they mention that they have mental health, it's complete judgment on them and they're looked at differently.
Oh,
So
that's interesting. See, I would kind of challenge that statement a little bit, and kindly. Um, I actually think the judgment exists universally, and I almost make the argument like those that are more public facing take on the brunt of even higher degrees of judgment. I think what's really fascinating is how we as human beings have the ability sometimes to depersonalize others.
yeah, yeah. Hmm.
And, and and so like sometimes again, like if I'm talking with a coach who might have what I would call, say, an empathy wobble, where they just tend to think about, the people on their staff or their players on their team as almost like chess pieces just to be moved on the board, is I'm like, you're the leading actor in your movie. Like you're the main character of that story in your movie. But in their movie, you might be like a supporting actor, or you might be might even just be an extra who walks by in the background. And they're like, well, what do you mean? I'll go, oh, like say we were at a coffee shop. I'll go, you see that waiter over there? And they're like, yeah. I go, right now you're in their story, but you don't have a very important or impactful role. But in their story, everything that's going on in their lives is kind of going through their lens. And so I think what's interesting is, especially athletes that are televised, they can become depersonalized. Coaches too. So, it's really amazing because one of my aha moments is when I was doing this job, 20 years ago. I'm now this, not to sound like an old fart, but like, 27 years ago, I started doing this stuff. And I remember when I first started out, I was working with a very high profile team, very high profile coach, very high profile players. I went home for Thanksgiving break, and like a lot of people when they go home, they met up with their high school buddies, had a beer or two. And like a lot of high school buddies, like you kind of just talk about sports. Like that's something that kind of keeps us all together. So one of my really close friends starts going, you know what's wrong with Team X and Coach Y and Player Z? He goes, these guys, they're a bunch of bums and, F them and all this kind of, and like, I mean, he's just crushing them. And I'm just thinking to myself, like, I work with those folks. And I didn't say that to him, like, because again, I'm trying to respect it. But I'm like, I work with those folks. How is it that you can talk so freely about them in such a depersonalized way? Ah,
Did
that
they
guy
know
should
you
get
worked with them?
fired.
Right. Did they know that you worked with them?
They knew that I worked at the university athletic department. So I
Okay.
think it's a fair assumption that I would know these folks. So I wasn't overt like, hey, I work with this high profile team, but it was, I mean, like, I just remember there was an NFL head coach who called me into his office once, and I said, what's the matter? Like he looked shook. And I mean, this is a pretty strong, powerful guy, super smart, very talented. I really respected his talents. And he was visibly shook. I was like, what's up? He goes, my 6-year-old came home from school today and handed me a picture, which was a meme of my face, the coach, with a bunch of guns pointed at his head. And it said fire name. And it was the last name. So it was also the kid's last name. So he goes, someone at school gave this to my son. What do I do with this? And so we had to like unpack that. I mean, we had to unpack it for him and his impact. Like he was like, he's like, this job, as much as I love this job, it shouldn't have this kind of impact on my family. Like my family didn't sign up for this. And,
Yeah.
and,
And thank
and
you for sharing that because I hope the audience takes that and sits with that for a minute.
well, the thing, again, no one's a villain in their own story, right? So
Right.
one thing I always kind of point out is I go like, look, without that kind of passion and commitment, none of us that work in this space would have a job, right? Like if no one's coming to watch, like we Lady Gaga, like I did it for the applause, right? So like I'm glad that they have that kind of investment. I just don't understand why in their decision-making process, they didn't think about this coach as being somebody's father.
Right. And that's what I mean. Like, just sit with that for a second. Like, you know, I think people forget what we do and how we respond to things. It does affect other people, right? It's going to do something. And it's not going to be just one person, you
And,
know? So
and just to pull on that thread for a sec, because I think we're really touching on something that I'm passionate about, which is, I'm grateful when players are comfortable enough to share their story.
Hmm.
I'm also mindful of when they share that story and it gets exploited. So in an interview, a player will say, like, hey, I struggle with depression. And then you have 300 LinkedIn gurus that take that video clip and repost it and retweet it with their own kind of empowerment message. And I'm going like, and it's really interesting, right? Because I've been with some, I've sat with some players, athletes who have done that. It's been very courageous. It was very like emotionally exhausting. They're like, wow, I put it out there. But then all of a sudden it became a narrative that they could no longer control or spin. And then people would react to it. Like you look at like, in the last Olympics, last two Olympics, there was some people who were pretty public about some of their mental health. And then the way society kind of reacted to it, sometimes it lacked empathy or sometimes it was overcompensatory. We lost the humanity of it. And so I guess part of part of it is as we continue to talk about this, as we continue to normalize it, I think it's great that you're pursuing that quest. We should also recognize, like, when we turn off the lights, again, going back to like a movie metaphor, I always think, isn't it amazing? Like you watch some of these superhero movies where like they just destroy Gotham City, right? Like the bad guys and the good guys both are just crushing. Like buildings are coming down and cars are getting just thrown. Like, Superman picks up a car and throws it at, General Zod. And it's like, dude, that's somebody's car. Like I always thought to myself, like, what'd be kind of an interesting movie is if they did the movie after the credits roll. Because see, after the credits roll, we're like, oh, the sun sets, we all feel good. And I'm going like, hey, how about the guy who comes out of work to go find his car and it's not where he parked it, it's now 3 miles downtown and it's wedged in the side of some, coffee shop. And he's got to call his insurance adjuster, and his insurance adjuster, and he's going like, hey, and now of course now the insurance adjuster is like, well, do you have superhero coverage? He's like, I didn't know I needed superhero coverage. Like the complexity of life that happens after the moment, right? I guess is where I'm kind of talking about. So again, when someone heroically shares their story, to the people who retweet that message, it's like, up, fade to black, credits roll, we all feel good. And I'm like, right, but that person now has to still get up the next day and brush their teeth and go face the world and all the interactions and repercussions of whatever it is that that moment stimulated. And we should think about the complexity of that.
Yeah. Yeah, you are absolutely right. And I appreciate you sharing that because I think people, again, don't think about that. I speaking with one of my clients, touching a little bit kind of like what you're saying, when people think about mental health and different things, when when someone with mental health is getting ready to go out into the world, they're thinking of a total different world than someone who doesn't have mental health, like someone with mental health is thinking, let me get through the day without having a panic attack. Let me get through the day without, um, seeing someone, or let me get through the day without smelling something that's going to remind me about something, right? Like they're trying to get through the day just to survive, right? Or maybe someone else is just trying to get through the day without landing in traffic, right? So the worlds are completely different. And
Yeah.
so I think that goes back to we'll say elite versus the norm, right? The worlds are completely different. And so when someone of the norm comes and talks about having mental health and someone from the elite talks about mental health, it's going to be looked at differently and probably judged a little bit differently because of the two different worlds.
When we created, and again, this was like a million years ago, but when, Becky Bell, who was the life skills coordinator at Arizona, when she really led this program that we created called Step Up, which was a bystander intervention program. Amazing program, did so much good, really proud to be a part of it. when we created Step Up, it was funny because most people focused on the bystander intervention aspect, which was like, hey, if you're at a party and someone's, drunk, and what can we do to help that person out? But there was two sections. One was bystander intervention, the other was pro-social behavior. And so to your point about the different lenses, you just never know who's suffering and in what ways they're suffering. And you can make the argument we're all living with some level of discomfort. But what's nice is, regardless of having that awareness or not of what suffering or what discomfort this person near you is having, we can always hold the door open for them. And you just never know how powerful that one small act of kindness. And that was something that we used to talk a lot about with the Step Up program was, just doing something nice for someone. You just never know how that might ripple. So, it's like pay for the person's coffee behind you, that kind of stuff, if you can afford it.
Yes.
It's funny how you mentioned client, like, so I find it's really interesting, right? Like some practitioners use the word client. My dad was always against that term because, again, being a physician, he said it just, for him, it felt like it was a business transaction. So he liked patient. And what was interesting was, so I used to use patient until one of my mentors goes, when you use the word patient, you're kind of promoting a sickness model. And if you use client, then you're not labeling somebody as sick. So I said, okay, client's sort of business and just depersonalized. Patient is labeling somebody as sick. Then I was like, okay, well, maybe I'll just refer to them as athletes or players, like I'm kind of doing in this conversation. But then it's like, well, but wait a minute, to your point, like that player could also be a father or a son or a friend. So it's like, okay, so then it's like, what is the best way to describe the people that we're working with and collaborating with? And it's like to say the people we're working with or collaborating with, but that's so long-winded and it's a mouthful. So it's funny how important language is and some of the tones and hints that the breadcrumbs that we leave, if you will.
Yeah.
I digress. Sorry. Anyways.
No, like it's okay. Please stop apologizing because I like where you went with that because that is so true. Like when I say client, it does sound like just like a business transaction, but I don't know how else to say it. And yeah, patient, well, I'm not a doctor, so that's why I don't say patient, right? So I'm like, I always just say client, but sometimes I'll use words, I'll call names that are just crazy names like Susie Q or something, but because of we're doing a podcast, I didn't want to just use Susie Q. But yeah, I understand where you were going with that because that does sound not very personable. And I like to be personable with the people I'm working with. So
Well, and
I,
I think, again, language is powerful. And then there are certain terminologies that maybe we can execute without offense. So for example, um, someone told me recently that you can go back to using the phrase you guys, that you guys is actually not gender determinate.
oh,
Now, some people might argue, how can that not be gender determinate? But what my colleague was telling me is that is now back on the table.
well, that's good to know because I
Well,
really
I
like
don't know. I
that.
don't know. I mean, it depends on who's offended by it and what ways they're offended. But it is interesting because, the part of the world that I came from, you guys was a fairly frequent kind of reference. Hey, you guys, where do you want to go
Yeah.
to eat?
Yeah.
And then it was like, well, just change it to y'all. And it's like, okay, but like I'm not from a part of the world where I use y'all, you know. And then it's like, okay, well, am I subjugating? I don't know. So I'm always mindful of language because I never want to induce discomfort or hardship on others, especially not intentionally. And yet at the same time, I don't want to eliminate the ability to communicate a thought. So,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
whether you call a person a client or a person a patient or a person an athlete or a person a daughter or a son or I don't know. I don't, maybe we're going down a rabbit hole that has no conclusion, but I'm always mindful of the label, right? And the impact of the label.
Yeah. Which that again just states how like who you are as a person and how genuine and mindful and how good you are. Like that just shows your heart. Most people would not think that hard about it, but you do. So that says a lot about you. So
Thanks.
yeah.
I
Um,
try. I mean, look, I'm human and I definitely make mistakes, and I've definitely had some bought lessons where I was like, hey, you guys, and someone would say, I'm sorry, but you can't, and I'm like, oh, so I try. I don't want to run out of things to say. That's the other, that's the other part. It's like maybe I'll just start grunting or humming or something. Like at some point we got to also be able to continue to convey messages.
as long as yeah, as long as the point's getting across somehow, that's what matters, and no one's getting hurt. Yeah. So, I lost what we were talking about other than clients and patients.
Yeah, we were all over the place there.
We just went all over the map there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's been fun though. Um, no, so with the mental health conversation there, um, do you see with the social aspect of it and the personal life, how that could be a really hard part for the athletes or the entertainment field?
Yeah, I mean, I, I think like even if you take it outside the concept of high performers, right? You know, disordered eating and eating disorders, that's not a universal diagnosis. Like there are parts of the world where you do not see a high level of or even the existence of eating disorders, especially places where there's food scarcity. So you got to kind of ask yourself, like, why do eating disorders kind of exist in certain pockets, regions, cultures, and not others? And so I think there is this idea and conceptualization about why does why do certain aspects of the human condition exist? What causes impact and influence on these events? You human beings are not um, isolated creatures. They're not like sharks or other types of species on this planet that are more isolated. And we are also like a lot of other species on this planet, we are resource dependent and resource influenced. So again, I go back to you have some cultures where obesity is more of a risk than an eating disorder, or what's interesting is you have certain communities where obesity and eating disorders coexist, and others where neither exist. And I think that's worth exploring. And some people go, "Oh, that's a no-brainer." It's like, hey, um, food scarcity will take both obesity and eating disorders right out. But then you go, how is that possible, right? Like you would think if it's a mental condition, then anytime the human is present, that should be susceptible, right? So bring it back to the question. Sorry, bring it back to the question. Does a um, does a guy who installs cable, like your table, the guy who repairs your cable television, does he have a full spectrum of human emotion and have incidences and impacts in his life that could induce? Yes. Um, so let's say I've got the cable repair person coming to my house later today, and they show up and they're frantic and frazzled. And you go, hey, what happened? I almost got in a car accident. And, that was crazy, right? But I survived it and I'm pretty shook. It was pretty intense. Like I skipped on some ice and it was intense. You go, okay, there's anxiety and impact. And then you go, okay, now let's say um, it's the starting quarterback at a university that has a stadium that can fit 110,000 people in it. And they say, I almost we lost the game. I threw 3 interceptions. We lost the game, and 110,000 people were booing me simultaneously amongst the millions others that were watching it on TV. And I'm 18 years old. I don't, like I've never been booed before, much less booed by that large of an audience. And I'm pretty shook. So both are shook by events in their lives. The question is do you treat that as the same or do you treat that as different? You're waiting for me to answer. I would treat it as different.
Yeah. Yeah. And how, like, so that goes into my next question. How how do you treat the stress of that? Right? So the normal, my stress and what I think of daily stress is definitely not the same as having thousands of individuals angry at me because I didn't make the winning shot.
Right. So where the universality exists for me is in the construct of the emotion. I am so honored and blessed to have been trained by one of the best, Albert Ellis. Dr. Albert Ellis, the creator of rational motive behavior therapy. He and I co-led a group for 2 years, and he trained me when I was an intern fellow, and then I ended up becoming a staff member at the Albert Ellis Institute, and then ultimately a supervisor. So an amazing, wonderful environment to learn and grow and develop skills. But what he also did because of his brilliance and his theory with RABT was he gave me a theoretical construct, right? So, for example, with anxiety, um, anxiety is a future-oriented emotion. This is what he taught me. Anxiety is a future-oriented emotion. We're not anxious about today. We're anxious about the repercussions of today or the impact of today that could happen tomorrow. So if I'm anxious about the test, I'm really anxious about what failing the test would do to me tomorrow. If I'm anxious about missing the shot, I'm really worried about how that impacts my life tomorrow. So it's future. The second aspect of anxiety that's worth unpacking is it's always about, and he always emphasized this, perceived, not necessarily genuine, but perceived threat or danger. So we're not anxious about winning the lottery or some other good fortune. We're anxious about some kind of threat or danger. And then he deciphered and distinguished between two types of threat or danger. One is more of like a life threat. Like if I walk down a dark alleyway, I can be worried that someone's going to jump out of the dark alleyway and kill me. That's a life threat danger. And the second kind of perceived threat or danger is one that he defined as an ego threat. So if I fail this test, I could have a life threat, which is if I fail this test, I don't get a good job, and now I'm living in a van down by the river eating government cheese. Or it could be an ego threat, which is if I fail this test, then I am a failure by definition. And then I think horribly of myself. So when we unpack like the 100,000 people booing you threat, I find the most common thread has a lot to do with both a potential life threat and ego threat. And what I mean by life threat is not like someone's going to kill me threat, but more like the idea of when I'm rejected, I am kicked out of the tribe. So, I always think this is fascinating. The number one phobia in humans is snake. More people are afraid of snakes than anything else. And it's interesting because there is a person, gosh, I'm blanking on her name. She's so brilliant. She theorized, she's a neuroscientist. She theorized that traumatic events are hardwired in our DNA. So she's the daughter of, or the granddaughter of a Holocaust survivor. And so part of her theory and her research had a lot to do with people who survived significant trauma. It was hardwired in their DNA. And so as they had children, some of the DNA was altered. So part of the reference is number one fear of snakes. Even though more people die right now, presently, more people die from cars than they do by snakes, we're still more afraid of snakes as a species because there was a time where snakes were way more threatening and we survived those threats, those life threat dangers. But the DNA was hardwired to help us continue to be afraid of snakes. So, sorry, big tangent there. but I find it fascinating.
No, I like it. It's good. Thank
The
you.
number two phobia, though, is social phobia, like public speaking and stuff.
Oh,
And you go, well, how could that be? If snakes was life threatening back in 100,000, a couple thousand years ago, why would social phobia be so threatening? And I think it goes back to the concept, which is like, again, a couple thousand years ago when we were walking around and living in tribes, in caves and tribes and stuff like that, like to be dismissed from the tribe was also as dangerous as getting bit by a snake. Like it was really hard to survive out in the savannah on our own. So understanding that this is how I kind of orient and acclimate to a fear response or an anxiety response. See, I think people who maybe are less clinically trained might take a different approach when someone's anxious about being booed by 100,000 people, because they're not taking into account this sort of potential DNA life threat. Hey, I'm going to get kicked out of the tribe. So you got to kind of unpack that with the person, right? Say, okay, well, help me understand what booing means to you. Because it's not like getting stabbed in the back. But what is booing? Well, booing means that they don't like me. Okay, so 100,000 people don't like you. Can we, one, separate the actor from the action? And they go, what do you mean? I go, well, are they booing you as a person, or are they booing something you did, like throwing 3 interceptions? They go, oh, they're booing what I did. But I really think of myself as a football player. I go, I bet you do, but you're more than a football player. You're a daughter, you're a friend, sorry, you're a son, you're a friend, you're a cousin, you're a brother. And they go, yeah, but it's the football one that's most important to me. And I go, right. That's why, like, you don't mind if someone boos you, or like if your sibling says, hey, you missed my birthday, you're a bad brother. And you go, right, like they still love me. They go, okay, so let's talk about this idea of rejection and why that has impact, and why 100,000 people who really don't know you very well, other than the 3 interceptions, why they have salience or value in your brain. And that's the kind of stuff that I think someone who, repairs cable, they might understand it if they were in that situation, and they might feel that too if they were in that situation, but they might not tap into it unless they think about it with that kind of lens. They just say, don't throw 3 interceptions.
I like it. I could talk to you all day long. I the same vibe. We're on the same wavelength here, and I could just pick your brain all day about where you're at with it. Um, thank you so much for coming on and sharing all of your insights and thoughts with the mental health. I really appreciate everything that you have shared. Is there anything else that I might have missed that you would like to share before we wrap up the show?
I can't think of anything. I mean, I think this was a pretty fun conversation, and hopefully um, the people who get a chance to listen to it or watch it find some value out of it.
Oh, I'm sure they will. I know I definitely did. And I hope that I can get you back on the show here in the future, because I really did enjoy speaking with you. But we unfortunately are out of time for the show today, but I did enjoy speaking with you, and I hope everyone has a very Merry Christmas. But until next time, I will chat with everyone soon.
Thank you so much for the time. This was a treat.
Yes, thank you so much. You have a wonderful, very Merry Christmas. Bye, everyone.